So while Marvel has been getting the gang back together to try and recapture some of its former glory, the DC branch of the comic book world has been working to reboot its cinematic universe in hopes of a brighter tomorrow. I think after a somewhat mixed bag with James Gunn's Superman movie last year, the cinematic universe now expands further with Supergirl. The question is the movie another step in the right direction for the DCU, or is it just one step forward, two steps back for the struggling genre? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. Well, we can go ahead and just pull off the Band-Aid, and that is, unfortunately, that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that is Hollywood churning out more lackluster superhero content, having lost the plot, I think, of what made the genre boom in the first place. I think Millie Alcock does do well with the title character, but Supergirl is yet another just derivative comic book movie. I think a disappointing film that not only fails to soar as a standalone story, but one that I think raises questions about the future of the genre as a whole. So let's get into this a little bit. I think as some of you may have already seen, actress Millie Alcock received some scorn for her somewhat ill-advised interview comments that I think some people took as being disparaging towards Christian men. I personally thought the controversy was way overblown, but either way, she is the least of this film's problems. She does, I think, make the most of just a bad situation, bringing the kind of rock and roll sensibility and even a Gen Z flavor to the role. I think for anyone looking for positives in the very lukewarm start to this new DCU, it's got to be with the casting. I think David Corenswet is an excellent Superman, and he proves that again in a supporting role here. And I actually think that Alcock flashes potential to become a great Supergirl. They just need way better stories to work with. Supergirl may not be the worst comic book movie in recent memory, but it is arguably the most uninspired, because the story is just an unfocused mess that really never gives audiences a reason to care or become emotionally invested in any of the characters or the events beyond just a pre-existing affinity to the comics. Now, I will say to its credit, the film at least attempts to tell a contained kind of story with personal stakes rather than just another iteration of the fate of every world and the endless multiverse hangs in the balance. The movie's inciting incident is that Supergirl's dog is poisoned and she needs to go get the antidote, which is simple and effective. I think there is a version of this movie that does work as a pure girl with her dog tail with a sort of John Wick style escalation. But this is not that movie. Instead, the filmmakers seemingly cannot resist sort of the pull to try and fulfill some sort of misguided quota of just comic book content, because Supergirl continues to add more characters and subplots to the point that not even the characters on screen seem to clearly know what their objective is. Amid all the spectacle and I think convoluted world building, the film just continually sort of undercuts Supergirl's, I think, more interesting personal journey. There are several flashbacks that attempt to build out her backstory and her origin story, dealing with the death of her planet Krypton and her exile to Earth. There are some interesting narrative threads there to work with, but the film is just way too distracted with empty calorie action sequences to ever build upon her internal struggles in any kind of meaningful way, which just totally kind of mutes the emotional impact of her eventual kind of internal growth at the end. The film also features perhaps the least interesting villain that the comic book genre has ever produced, with a bumbling space pirate that has no personality or motivations or menacing presence or even thematic tension with Supergirl. On the other hand, Jason Momoa's appearance as Lobo, a morally questionable mercenary, is admittedly far more entertaining, but the character just serves no purpose to the story beyond an almost desperate attempt at fan service. He's given no characterization or necessary narrative function or even an interesting relationship with anyone else on screen. Instead, he really only shows up just sort of periodically to add some spice to the action scenes. The film tries to give audiences sort of more and more things to be excited about or care about, which makes the few plot lines that are actually compelling end up feeling kind of watered down or almost as an afterthought. And honestly, that it somehow manages to fumble a plot about rescuing a cute dog, which should be a bankable cheat code for really any film, is to me just an indictment on the movie. Now, despite the problems that I personally had with it, I did think James Gunn's Superman movie had a clear kind of tonal and thematic identity, where in contrast, Supergirl has absolutely no idea what kind of movie it wants to be, I think kind of awkwardly balancing several conflicting tones and approaches. It's often like goofy and irreverent, but at other times toys with a bit more of like a gritty, almost like R-rated approach, and I think the result is sort of an uncomfortable middle ground. For example, a major plotline concerns the villains kidnapping young girls as brides to sort of further their all-male race, and it's a pretty serious plot device that feels out of place in an otherwise very silly film, and it is, I think, handled with this kind of casualness that honestly is almost borderline offensive. In a similar way, Supergirl, I think, for the most part, is sort of a story about grief, but the characters are sort of cracking too many jokes and quips to ever actually have time to grieve. And now, obviously, I think it is possible to balance like the silly and the serious. I think comics have been doing that for decades, but Supergirl just struggles to crack that code. I'll add too that I think the film also has a somewhat sort of uncertain moral compass, because at one point Supergirl allows an innocent young girl to have her throat cut and be killed in order to sort of keep another young girl from killing the murderer, kind of wanting to preserve the innocence of sort of that second girl's soul, which is obviously a very sort of questionable decision. Then later she preaches sort of goodness over violence and revenge, only to then immediately sort of violently kill the enemy herself. And I know that like Supergirl as a character is still like developing as a hero, so I think like some like moral messiness is understandable, but to me it just often felt more as if like the film itself is uncertain about what she represents or stands for. And I think because of all that, and I think despite some like I think good messages sprinkled in, it's just not a film that I would like enthusiastically recommend for younger viewers. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, for language, there are like frequent profanities. I did not catch any like F words, but there are plenty of uses of words beginning with the letter S, as well as several with B. And you do also have kind of her using words such as like frickin'. As far as violence, the action is mostly sort of the bloodless sort of comic book fare, although there is violence that is done towards young characters, including like a teen girl who has her throat cut. And there's also just, like I mentioned earlier, the implication of like sexual violence towards teen girls who are captured to be brides for adult men. And for sexuality, really nothing here, which is maybe a bit surprising, beyond sort of what I mentioned about this, I think disturbing implication of teenage girls being sold and forced to essentially act as like sex slaves for adult men. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I think as we see in this movie and also in last year's Superman movie, Superman seems more naturally prone to be good, but his cousin needs a bit more convincing. And like as Supergirl explains in this movie, he sees the good in all people, but I see the truth. And in some like interesting dialogue after that, despite Superman being older in age, she refers to him as young at heart, since she doesn't think that he has experienced like the trials and challenges that she has. And really like much of the character arc in this film is her becoming more like Superman. And her like musing about the almost like childlikeness of Superman made me think of Jesus telling his followers in Matthew 18:3, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The sort of like childlike optimism and this earnest belief in the goodness of people that Superman represents is a virtue rather than some sort of like defect, and it does sort of sharply contrast with the almost like juvenile selfishness that Supergirl demonstrates, at least early in the film. And in that way, I think the film suggests that like goodness is not just for the naive, but is actually a sign of a greater moral strength. And throughout the film, like Supergirl sort of slowly discovers the strength that comes from goodness. She repeatedly kind of attempts to prevent another young girl from seeking revenge and like acting out in violence, and instead she challenges her, your life will be your revenge. It's a very sort of like counter-cultural approach that does echo sort of biblical wisdom that, as like Proverbs 25 says, in doing good works and like treating even our enemies with love and respect, Christians will heap burning coals on his head. Both like Superman and Supergirl confront the evil of a fallen world, but while Supergirl kind of fights against the world that she thinks has wronged her, Superman attempts to like inspire others to rise above and just seek goodness. And by the end of the film, Supergirl is still very much like a work in progress, but she has sort of clearly begun to see the world through Superman's eyes. So in the end, I think much like its hero, Supergirl feels like a story in search of a purpose. I think audiences with this an affinity to the source material, or who merely want just another dose of comic book storytelling, may find enough like worthwhile entertainment here. But for anyone else, the DCU may already be back at a crisis point. Superman was, I think, a flawed film, but one that promised a compelling new take, or perhaps an old take, on like the iconic character, and a welcomed return to like, an optimistic and earnest tone, which did have me intrigued. But Supergirl, unfortunately, mostly undoes that goodwill, suggesting that the new will look curiously like the old. I think Supergirl may be the so-called woman of tomorrow, but her debut film never soars beyond any of yesterday's problems. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you share some of my opinions on the movie, or perhaps you had a more positive experience, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation on it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. I got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith in Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. We'd love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.